Hey everyone, welcome to Motivational Mornings. Now, we're going to do something a bit different this episode. We're actually going to go back to the vault and re-release a previous episode of Motivational Mornings. Now, this episode was originally released all the way back in the summer of 2016. So I hope you enjoy it. Thanks again for listening, and go win the day.
Good morning and welcome to Motivational Mornings, the podcast that gets you going before you get going. Good morning and welcome to Motivational Mornings. My name is Vivi and I'm here again with my co-host Ryan. There was once a very wise professor whose words of wisdom students would come far and wide to hear. One day, as usual, many students began to gather into the teaching room. They came in and sat down very quietly, looking to the front with keen anticipation, ready to hear what the teacher had to say. Eventually, the teacher came in and sat down in front of the students. On one side of the teacher was a large glass jar. On the other side was a pile of golf balls. Without saying a word, the teacher began to pick up the golf balls one by one and place them very carefully in the glass jar. When the golf balls were in the jar, the professor turned to the students and asked, "Is the jar full?" "Yes," said the students. "Yes, professor, the jar is full." Without saying a word, the professor began to drop small, round pebbles carefully into the large glass jar, so that they fell down between the golf balls. When all the pebbles were in the jar, the professor turned to the students and asked, "Is the jar now full?" The students looked at one another, and then some of them started nodding and saying, "Yes, yes, professor, the jar is now full." Without saying the word, the professor took some fine sand and let it trickle gently through the glass jar, and where it settled around the pebbles and the golf balls. When all the sand was in the jar, the professor turned to the students and asked, "Is the jar now full?" The students were not so confident this time, but the sand had clearly filled all the space in the jar. So a few still nodded and said, "Yes, professor, the jar is now full. Now it's finally full." Without saying a word, the professor then pulled out 2 cans of beer from underneath the table and poured the entire contents into the jar, effectively filling the empty space between the sand. The students laughed. When the beer reached the brim, the professor turned to the students and asked, "Is the jar now full?" Most of the students were silent, but 2 or 3 of them answered, "Yes, professor, the jar is now full. Now it is for sure." Without saying a word, the professor took a handful of salt and sprinkled it slowly over top of the beer. When all the salt had dissolved into the beer, the professor turned to the students and asked once more, "Is the jar now full?" The students were totally silent. But eventually, one brave student said, "Yes, professor, the jar is now full." "Yes," said the professor, "the jar is now full." The professor then said, "A story always has many meanings, and you will each have understood many different things from this demonstration. Discuss now quietly amongst yourselves what meanings the story has for you. How many different messages can you find from it and take from it?"
Well, I gave this question some thought, Vivi, and off the top of my head, I can say that I truly believe that this story symbolizes that there's not just one interpretation of anything. There can be many messages extracted from a story like this, and I think it's important to recognize that each meaning is as important and as valid as any other. But when thinking about this story a little bit more, I think I get even more from the symbolism of filling the glass jar. I think another way to interpret the story would be to think of the jar representing your life. The golf balls are the important things: your family, your children, your health, your friends, your favorite passions. Things that, if everything else was lost, and only these golf balls remained, your life would still be full. The pebbles are the other things that matter, like your job, your house, your car. The sand is everything else, the small stuff. Because if you put the sand into the jar first, there is no room for the pebbles or the golf balls. The same goes for life. If you spend all your time and energy on the small stuff, you'll never have room for the things that are important to you. Pay attention to the things that are critical to your happiness. Play with your children. Take time to get the medical checkups. Take your partner out for dinner. There will always be time to clean the house and fix the rubbish. Take care of the golf balls first, the things that really matter. Set your priorities. The rest is just sand. Then, as far as the beer, what's the big significance of that, you may ask? Well, it just goes to show that no matter how full your life is, there's always room for a couple of beers. That wraps up today's episode at Motivational Mornings. We'd like to remind you guys to please subscribe to the show and leave us an iTunes rating and review. Vivi and I love reading all the great reviews and feedback you guys have been providing. We want to continue giving you guys amazing content every single week, and that's going to help us do that. But most importantly, guys, thanks for listening and have a great day.